behalf of the center, and thank you for coming, and please stay for the discussion and the following theater performance. And let me welcome especially Dunja Mijatovic, the media freedom representative of OSCE, and Andrei Richter, who's director of the staff of the media freedom representative. They came specifically for this event from Vienna, so we are very grateful to them that they help us to think about the issues of so-called hate speech, and of course I very much welcome all the other panelists and moderators as well. I don't go down the whole list just only in order to save time, and we will hear about them and from them on the panels. Let me just thank my colleague Eva Bognar and Kate Coyer, my colleagues in CMCS, for helping to organize this, and also Renata Luiz for the same reason from the Legal Studies Department. And let me just very shortly in 1 minute outline what we will do. Today you can pick up a copy of the program outside as well, just to see the outline of the seminar, and also you can pick up flyers for the book, and you can see the book with 2 display copies, and you can see OSCE publications as well as publications of the Roma initiatives of the Open Society Foundation, and also you can see the script of the hate speech monologues, which will be performed from 6 p.m. on some of the small posters. The date is March, but don't worry, you are not late. It is just for the first performance, and we wanted to use them as well because otherwise the information is the same. And so the book, the content and context of so-called hate speech, the flyers of which you saw outside, and that I co-edited with a friend, Michael Hertz from Cardozo School of Law, New York, and for which Miklos Haraszti wrote a very nice preface, and Michel, Rosenfeld, and Andrei Richter wrote chapters for, very nice chapters for. So this book has been meant to sort of help us to think about responses to incitement to hatred in improved ways, to find responses that work better than we have been able to do so far against such speech, to counter such speech. And so the purpose of today's public seminar is to build on the book and all other work that our experts, friends on the panels, and you in the audience will bring in, and I hope it's fine with everyone that the whole thing will be without tape, so it can serve as an educational material for those as well who cannot be present. The structure of the day, as you saw in the program, is that we will have 2 relatively long panels. Both panels will be 2 hours. The reason for this is that we wanted to allow time for substantial conversation after the presentations by the panelists and comments also by the moderators. And the panels will be about the 2 legal approaches to incitement to hatred. The first panel will examine the approach which suggests that incitement to hatred must be prohibited because of its harmful content, because of its content, regardless whether it creates imminent danger or not. So on this panel, of course, other things can come up as well, but we would like to focus on this issue, whether this legal response can work. How can it work? Those who suggest suggest this so-called content-based restriction to incitement to hatred, how do they suggest to draw the line? How would they differentiate between speech that is offensive, but they would still think that that belongs to free speech, and speech that should be prohibited because of its content? How would they address the issue of contextuality? So how would they draw the line differently, for example, in the United States or Bosnia and Herzegovina or Hungary? The second panel, though, will look very critically also on the danger test, on the other approach, which says that we should prohibit such speech, however awfully ugly it is, nasty it is, only when it creates imminent danger. We would like to have the proponents of those approaches to say exactly when that danger is imminent enough to prohibit that speech, whether intent is required. So we would like to go to details. So just with this introduction, I would like to ask everyone to focus on those practical details. Imagine that you are talking to a policeman, a prosecutor, a judge, who need to know where to draw the line in a specific environment, in a specific country, about a specific content. General statements about what we believe about freedom of speech or other stuff won't help those people who need to apply the law. We need to be very specific. So I ask your help in that. And please stay at the end also for the theater performance, which will be the sort of other part of the event. While the first part will focus on the legal responses, on the issue where the state has to intervene with its law enforcement power to stop speech, which should be, of course, a very exceptional case. And the theater performance will show how artistic educational responses can, I believe, much better address the roots of prejudice and hatred.
Our first speaker will be, by the schedule, Andrei Richter, who is a Russian media scholar and a very leading one in Moscow State University. And we are, the international community is lucky to have him as director of Dunya Mijatovich's office. And he is, just like Dunya, coming from Vienna to address this time the Russian case.
Thank you, Miklos. Thank you, Miklos. Well, when getting prepared for this speech, I looked into the outline that was drafted by Peter and Miklos, I guess, and I noted that the first panel is more focused on the content and finding out what kind of content should be really criminalized or not criminalized, banned, how to ban it, etc., etc. Also, I mean, I speak in this room at least for the third time, and I think that a couple of times I spoke on the hate speech, so I didn't want to say the same things which I said in the past. So I choose a very narrow topic to discuss with you, but although it's narrow both in the number of cases, court cases in Russia, narrow also in the meaning of the hate speech as well, but this narrow area is quite important for political speech in Russia, and the way that the criminal code is used in regards to this part of the hate speech is quite emblematic of the state of the freedom of the media in Russia. Also, I choose the topic of hate speech towards social groups as a very important, in my view, topic, because the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation just less than 2 years ago adopted a quite important resolution, which is, in American terminology, is a form of restatement of torts for the courts of general jurisdiction on extremist speech. And the key point, basically, of this resolution is a failure of the Supreme Court to address the issue and to judge what is a social group and how to treat cases related to hatred towards social groups. Very quickly, because I don't know what is my time limit, but I will still try to go through the legal provisions related to the hate speech in the Russian Criminal Code. The criminal code, the current criminal code adopted in 1996, originally followed the text of the Soviet Russian criminal code adopted in the 60s in relation to the incitement of national, racial, and religious enmity. And it had no reference to a social group until it was amended, this particular article 282, until it was amended in 2003, and then amended again and again and again. But it was in 2003 that the article started to include social group as an object of hate speech, and additional amendments made in several years ago basically increase the penalty for such incitement. So that's how it looked originally until 2003, and that's how it looks today. And we see that it includes now incitement of hatred or enmity, as well as abasement of dignity of a person or a group of persons on the basis of gender, race, ethnicity, language, origin, attitude to religion, as well as affiliation to any social group, if committed in public, etc. And the fines are quite high, I should say, and it also involves imprisonment and other forms of penalties, including 3 forms of labor, which, if you're curious, I can describe what is the difference between these 3 forms of labor: obligatory, forced, and corrective labor. The problem that the Russian courts faced from the very beginning, from 2003, is what is a social group. It was not described in the criminal code. It was not described in any of the commentaries published on the criminal code. And the Soviet vision of a social group is basically, we used to speak about social classes: workers, peasants, and intelligentsia. But apparently it was, the criminal code didn't refer to the classes, it referred to groups which should be smaller to classes, but still it was not clear how to define a group and in what sense an attack on a person is also an attack on a social group. The case law, which has emerged slowly, but it has emerged since 2003, showed, of course, a number of cases with very unusual outcomes. In some cases, judges were frank enough to say that we don't understand what is a social group, and we don't believe the prosecution that being, for example, a member of a banking community or commercial community or the government at large means that the person is a member of this particular social group, and the hatred is against the whole group as such. But those are quite rare cases. In most cases, the judges tended to agree with the prosecution. And the most frequent, of course, were the cases when the social group meant police, other law enforcement agencies, judges, and different groups within the more general group of representatives of the state power and municipal authorities. Among other cases, there was a case when the court decided that an attack on a person was because he belonged to a social group of fans who liked a particular rock band. In one case, the person was accused of hate speech towards a social group of those who worked in a particular bank, and those working in the bank, in a particular bank, were called a social group of persons serving in the bank, and etc., etc. The most famous case related to when basically the whole problem became quite important in the eyes of the public was the case of Sava Terentiev in 2008. It was the first case when a blogger was tried in a Russian court on criminal charges for what he did in his blog. That was probably one of the factors why it was so the case itself was so popular, and it was also one of the first cases which had to do with a social group and Article 282. In this particular case, this young chap wrote in his blog a comment related to an article in a local newspaper in Syktyvkar in Komi Republic, part of the Russian Federation. The original article of the journalist in the newspaper in Syktyvkar was about the way the police treats NGOs that reveal abuses at the elections, local elections in Syktyvkar. So the journalist wrote quite a critical article. Then the blogger wrote in his blog about this article, and he made a comment which literally said, he said that he believed that it will be very good to put in the furnace in a ceremonial way each day stupid and uneducated policemen and continue like that until stupid and uneducated policemen are extinct. Prosecution started the case and did all the necessary actions related to that, including confiscation of the computer, arrest of the blogger, and brought the case to the court. In the court, Terentiev apologized to the policeman because he didn't want to offend the police as a social group. He said that he apologized also to the former inmates of the concentration camps during the war, because the prosecution implied that by saying that he wanted also to offend the social group of former inmates of the concentration camps in Germany. But nevertheless, the decision of the court was 1 year of imprisonment suspended sentence. And in 2009, Terentiev appealed, because he went through all the stages in the Russian courts, he appealed to the European Court of Human Rights. And in 2011, he left with his family to Estonia, where he got the political asylum. That was this particular case. There were quite a number of cases related to conviction of anti-fascists and anti-nationalists for attacking the social group of neo-fascists in the Russian Federation and the social group of Russian nationalists in the Russian Federation. All of those cases were quite, they were revealed by a number of NGOs because they were in local courts. There was a lot of debate among the civil society about whether the prosecution has the right to basically protect such social groups as neo-fascists. There were court convictions. And there was basically, after several years, there was a very huge mess on how to treat such cases and whether they are really in conformity with the law. Therefore, in 2011, the Supreme Court, when making the resolution on what is basically hate speech, what is extremist crime, decided to approach this issue. And the way the Supreme Court does it is they collect a group of experts. They also collect case law which existed by that time. They also put questions to the heads of the regional courts on their views. And so that was the only point, according to the scholarly discussion after the plenary meeting, because the meetings themselves are closed. But according to the scholarly discussion, that was the only point where the Supreme Court could not come to a single opinion. Because the studies made by the Supreme Court itself showed that in the West, for example, a social group, a notion of the social group exists very rarely. And if in the West the law speaks about social group, this law speaks about the groups which are already privileged, on the contrary, that the groups which are not privileged, which are subject to different attacks, and the law doesn't speak about privileged group of those who are in power, who are in majority, etc., etc. The Supreme Court also reviewed appeals made to it by the civil society, making the point that the court should explain what is a social group in the view that the law should protect really deprived persons like homeless people and minorities, etc., etc. The court also reviewed a request from the LGBT groups in Russia that the gay minority should be protected in Russia because they are subject of such hate attack most of other social groups. By the end of the day, the court said that we cannot tell what is a social group, and it's a task of the lawmaker to describe and to explain what is a social group, and not the Supreme Court. But at the same time, Supreme Court made several remarks which showed the position of the court in this regards. First of all, the Supreme Court in this resolution, and here is the title of the resolution on the slide as well as the date, it said that there should be a balance between the so-called public interest, although I think that freedom of the media is also a public interest, like fundamentals of the constitutional system, integrity and security of the Russian Federation, and the human rights, including freedom of information and freedom of the media. So it's basically an instruction to the courts that when reviewing a case on Article 282, the courts should also take into account the necessity to protect freedom of the media. And in practical terms, it means that a judge should write in his decision, if it is a decision, a conviction for hate speech, he should write whether he took into account freedom of the media and how he took into account freedom of the media. If he doesn't do it, then it's a grounds for an appeal. Another point which the court made more specifically to the question of social groups is basically following the 2004 Council of Europe Declaration on Freedom of the Political Discussion and the text of the declaration, which somehow is very much liked by the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation. It quotes this declaration for the third time in its resolutions. And the Supreme Court said that the criticism in the media of officials or professional politicians, their actions and beliefs shall not as such be viewed in all cases as actions aimed at abasement of dignity of person, etc. It should not be viewed as hate speech, as Article 282. Of course, it is a very cautious approach. It says should not be viewed in all cases, and etc., etc. It also has some reservations that the court should look into the aim of such an attack, etc. But at least first of all, the Supreme Court singled out a particular case of officials and professional politicians in discussion of the hate speech, which was not, of course, by incident, but because the court wanted to show its approach to the problem without saying what should be the solution of the problem. And another quite important statement by the Supreme Court in this resolution is about freedom of political debate as such, and that during the political debate or scholarly debate, a person can use hate speech if there is no particular aim to incite hatred or enmity. That's, by the way, I mean, making a step aside, hatred or enmity was another big issue that the Supreme Court could not solve, because any discussion on what is the difference between hatred and enmity, and why it is or enmity, why it is not and enmity, was a huge, but still is a huge problem in treatment of the law, but that's a bit different subject. And criticism of political associations and beliefs should not be considered as incitement of hatred or enmity as such. That was also quite an important statement by the Supreme Court that is to be taken into account by the courts of general jurisdiction. The decision of the Supreme Court in 2011 was, surprisingly enough, quite an important factor in the case law which followed, because according to the NGOs that monitor hate speech and extremism in the media in general in Russia, such as Sava, which is quite internationally important and famous. They know that after 2011 resolution, the number of cases and convictions for hate speech towards a social group are in the decline. So my point, again, coming to the beginning, was to speak about quite a small but quite important part of the debate on the hate speech in the Russian Federation, legal debate on the hate speech, and to show how hate speech provisions, which are of general kind or clear kind, that used to be in the criminal code, in the constitution of the Russian Federation, also to mention, can be used now in order to target political beliefs or political thinking, and giving any person who is attacked by speech, a possibility basically to protect himself through the articles of the criminal code, because any one of us can find features of a personal attack as an attack on a social group. If you attack me as a bad professor, I can always say that you attack professors as such. If I speak about lazy students, a lazy student, the student can always say that this is an attack on a social group of students as such, etc., etc. In every person you can find features of a social group by profession, by origin, by place of living, by place of raising, by family, etc., etc. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I would call the attention in this last page to the fact that the Supreme Court in this case is far away from judging on whether dignity has been hurt. It is passing its judgment about the intention of the accused, and about judges practically assigns the regular judges to decide what was the aim, what was the intention of. So let's return to that issue later. What about if we continue with Michel?
Okay.
As it is written in the script, and I don't know if we need to introduce him, but he came to us from the Benjamin Cardozo School of Law, which is a long center of thinking, and in not small part because of Michel.
Thank you very much. So my role, if I understood it correctly, is to say I'm supposed to be defending regulation of hate speech based on content, which is in part true and in part not, and I'll try to specify this. And so to draw, I guess, one side of this debate, the arguments for one side of this debate. Just to be clear, so that the examples that I give are not put out of context, I don't defend a content-based approach as such, but a combination of content and context. Otherwise, you always have the parade of horribles. And let me, this may be discussed more in the next panel, but just to perhaps at least even out the debate a little bit, one of the greatest attacks on content-based prohibitions, a word, a sentence, a concept, is that it's impossible to draw lines. And I heard this Russian example, which is very telling because, I mean, it goes very far afield. The social group is so amorphous that anything can be done with it, and seems to me a very bad way to regulate. But I don't know enough about the Russian context to say other than this superficial comment. But there are, however, groups that are well identified, and there are expressions that are clear in what they connote. So let me, before I go with examples, say, first of all, that one of the biggest arguments against content regulation is the so-called, what we Americans call the slippery slope argument. And let me give you an example from another area, pornography, which is very contested, but still, in theory, it's criminalized in the United States. And how do we draw lines? And if you look at the 1920s and 30s and so forth, James Joyce's Ulysses was condemned as pornographic, obscene. Now, luckily, the Supreme Court was enlightened enough to reverse the state court that said that, but that gives you an idea that how we can always come up with examples when we try to regulate anything where these things are abused. Ordinary freedom of speech. There are countries in which what is perfectly ordinary speech, criticizing the head of state, etc., is turned into described as an offense that is not protected by freedom of speech. Let me also say that my position is atypical as an American. Most Americans usually agree with our Supreme Court's view, which is that hate speech is protected unless it incites to violence. So the key distinction is incitement to hatred, and somehow we cannot measure what that is, or it's sometimes what seems to incite hatred also it could be something that is a useful discourse, but somebody is very sensitive and therefore thinks I'm being targeted. Whereas the other distinction is very clear. If we have imminent danger, it's very clear. Actually, that is nonsense. The incitement to violence criterion is just as vague as the incitement to racial or ethnic or religious hatred. Why? Let me give you an example. In the 1950s and 60s in the United States, we had the incitement to, one way to characterize the incitement to hatred, and I think Professor Peter Molnar uses it in his own article, is there is a clear and present danger of violence. If I say to all of you, take the guns right outside this hall and go outside and kill some Americans, and you all are excited anti-Americans because the United States has just done something horrible to Hungary, then perhaps that is a clear and present danger, and most judges can figure it out.
No,
but
I would tell you, please continue.
Please continue. Okay, no, I don't want to get into a local political issue, but let me give you the actual case in the United States, which is not about hate speech, but is in the 1950s and 60s, merely belonging to the Communist Party in the United States could get you to jail. So how do you justify that? The highest protection in American jurisprudence is to political speech. And that's essential in a democracy, that we should be able to express political views. Now, it's true that the Communist Party advocated the violent overthrow of the United States government, but if you looked at who was in the Communist Party and how many people were in the Communist Party in the United States, and I know in Hungary it's a different story, but in the United States at those times, it was a minute number of people looked like weirdos, but the court, the Supreme Court of the United States, reasoned that mere belonging to the Communist Party presented a clear and present danger to overthrow the United States, one of the two superpowers. First of all, it must have been infiltrated by the Soviet agents, so at any moment it could destroy the United States. Therefore, sending a person 20 years to jail simply because he said, I joined the Communist Party. He did not make a statement. He did not join any demonstration. He attended a meeting and say, I am a member of this party. So this shows you that it's very easy to abuse the incitement to violence standard, just as it is easy to abuse the incitement to racial hatred standard. Okay, having said that, I draw a distinction between what I call hate speech in form, meaning that this is something we all understand to be hate speech, and hate speech in substance, which seems like something else, but in fact is hate speech, and that we can only tell in context. My general theory is that content prohibitions have to be matched with context, and let me give you a series of examples here to illustrate my position. The first example, let me read you what were the offending statements in a Canadian case called the Keekstra case, where the Canadian Supreme Court justified as constitutional punishing under criminal law a teacher in a high school who said this to his students. Keekstra told his pupils that Jews are treacherous, subversive, sadistic, money-loving, power-hungry, and child killers. Okay, it's standard anti-Semitism. I know it, you must have heard this in Europe sometimes. And then it says, I went to say that the Jews created the Holocaust to gain sympathy. Jews are inherently evil, and expected the students to write this in the exam or they failed the course. The man was dismissed, was charged, convicted, I don't know, served 30 days in jail, whatever it was. Now, I consider this hate speech. Is it very difficult to recognize? No. Is the group known? Yes. Is anti-Semitism something we've heard about? Yes. Okay. Let me give you another example. This is from a Danish case which went in front of the European Court of Human Rights, which is the Jersey case. A bunch of young people said that all immigrants are niggers and animals, and they should be sent back to their country of origin. The word nigger, particularly coming from the United States, is a particularly offensive word. It is hate speech when addressed to a person who is black. If we're going to prohibit it because it's an incitement to racial hatred, I think the courts would not have so much difficulty. Now, I say that context matters, and I use this example to show that because of two points, which, again, a court should be able to figure out if it has the right approach. One is when the word nigger is used among blacks, two blacks say, hey, nigger, which was at least at certain, I don't know if this is now that we have an American president who is biracial, maybe things are not as bad as they were 10, 20, 30 years ago, but what it meant was it was a sign of solidarity. Here we are in this white society that mistreats us, and we know how it is like. So if one person would be arrested because they were overheard, if one black person is arrested because they're overheard telling another black person, hey, nigger, obviously it would be absurd to call that hate speech. It's sort of fighting back the hate speech. Another example where it would be absurd to criminalize the utterance of this particular word, although everybody knows, and again, American blacks are well identified. We have a history of slavery, of beating them, etc. So it's not, again, like those social groups that can move right or left, or we don't, or become invisible. So the bottom line here is, if there were a play where the playwright wants to show some horrible aspect about American society at some point in time, and wants to make it vivid, and has a bunch of racists use the term, then beat up a few black people in order to teach a lesson about racism, hopefully teaching the audience, and again, in Peter Molnar's article for the book, he says how we should use art to counter racism, and I'm all for it, to use art to counter racism. Then, of course, it would be a complete travesty to condemn the playwright or the people showing the play, when in fact, in this context, the word was not hate speech, but was used to condemn hate speech. Okay. Now, having said that, and having given these examples, it seems to me that the incitement to racial hatred is a problem in many societies, and it differs from society to society. And so this is why I want to tie together some content-based prohibitions, and the ones I've given you are fairly easy to locate, and they're traditional forms of incitement to racial hatred. And there are others that are not. One of the areas where this doesn't fit this model is the whole controversy about Holocaust denial. And Holocaust denial is not classical hate speech, and it can be presented by certain academics as a genuine historical debate. And there are issues about the Holocaust that certainly should be debated. the number of victims. Sometimes numbers have to be revised. I know that, for instance, the number of children killed in Auschwitz was revised downwards at some point by completely legitimate historical research. But what is involved in Holocaust denial by people like David Irving, who have been convinced from that, convicted of that, for instance, he goes around making speeches that there was no Holocaust, or the Faurisson case, which is based on the French law, where basically Faurisson was saying that the gas chambers were an invention of Jews to gain sympathy, is that it is a code for. It may look like a factual statement about history, but it's a code message that is clearly anti-Semitic. And so in this case, again, it depends on the the content is clear, but on the context of the utterance and how far is the utterer going. If it is a genuine debate about history, it should be, of course, tolerated. If it is Holocaust denial, it's interesting that the United States and Germany treat that very differently. In the United States, it's permitted speech, but in Germany, it is criminalized. Now, one explanation, and this is where context matters, is that, of course, Germany has a history and the United States has nothing equivalent. So on this issue, there is a genuine difference. But there is a further difference, and that is that the United States test, and we have our neo-Nazi case, the Skokie case decided by the Supreme Court in 1978. The neo-Nazis in Germany were an extremely small, completely fringe, marginal group of people, and they had absolutely no traction, which is not necessarily that when one hears some of the rhetoric around this corner of the world, is not exactly the same situation in Central Europe and other parts of Europe. So it seems to me that it's a wise decision, pragmatic, to weigh sort of the, yes, we understand it's very offensive, and yes, we could submit it to more discourse because there's no real danger. And we're not talking about imminent danger, but there's no danger that the haters will inflame enough of the non-target group. There's a target group always and the broader audience. And the danger is not only offending the target group and the dignity of the target group, but also convincing the audience, the general audience, or attracting them to that point of view. In the United States, there was no danger. On the other hand, in the United States, we have tolerated a lot of hate speech, burning of the cross, which is another thing that I call, which is the symbolic act of the Ku Klux Klan that has a horrible history of violence against blacks. We have tolerated that as long as it doesn't show imminent danger of violence. And there, on the other hand, there is an example in the RAV case, which is a case decided by in 1992 by the U.S. Supreme Court, in which the question is, somebody went on private property, a black person and his family moved to a white neighborhood in Minneapolis in the north of the United States and was the victim of a cross burning on his property. Now, he could have won the case easily by suing for trespass, but he decided to sue under a statute that said that, that this kind of act, and specifically listed swastikas and burning the cross. These are symbols. This is what I call hate speech in form, because everybody understands what these symbols are in the United States. And the court said there was no danger of violence, therefore this is permitted speech. Now, here's what the court missed, and the Canadian court in Keekstra was quite perceptive on this issue. The issue was a political issue tinged with racism, which is, in many cities, white neighborhoods and white people, at least at the time, did not like blacks to move into the neighborhood, either because of racism or because eventually property values would go down, because it's not my racism, it's the racism of my neighbor, and so my property will go down. And undoubtedly, the majority of the neighbors of this black family would have been horrified at the thought that it would be associated with the cross burning. However, I'm sure that they were quite happy, without making the link that I'm making now, at least not explicitly, that this person actually left the neighborhood. After a cross was burned on his property, he left the neighborhood. Was there danger of violence? Not at all. They burned the cross and they left. Incitement to racial hatred, reliving racial tensions and so forth and so on? Yes. Would there be a line drawing problem if the people who did this, who committed this act, were maybe sent to jail for 30 days or given a fine that was hefty enough to deter them the next time? I don't think so. So therefore, I think that combining content with context in hate speech solves part of the problem. There will be gray areas, there will be difficult cases, but I think that it doesn't warrant abandoning any content-related approach. Thank you.
Bravo. I would have, as it is my task, to have many provocative questions. But I asked Peter's opinion, should I retain it after the two other speakers have spoken?
Yeah, maybe let's hear all
Okay.
speakers, and I
Then
sort of collect some questions myself.
wonderful. I have many provocations for you, Michel, but
I can't wait.
okay. But let's go on. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce Richter, who is presently a UN independent expert, namely for the UN Human Rights Council, and she is a worldwide independent expert on minority issues. And it is extremely intriguing for me because I am also serving, albeit as a country rapporteur for the Human Rights Council on Belarus, but Rita has a worldwide approach to these issues, and I am sure she will be strong on the issue of dignity.
Thank you very much. Do I need to speak into this so you can hear me? I should use it, okay. Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank actually Peter for his commitment to always bring up this very important issue, and also for including me into this panel. And I do hope that I will bring in diversity to the group, not only because of gender and ethnicity, but also because I often feel that the perspective of minorities is left out from the discussion of freedom of speech, which I think is a great failure, and I will try to bring up my arguments to support this. So I'm very happy that I can be here and then share with you one of my personal views, and then also the approach of the United Nations, as we are trying now also to develop some kind of scholarship on the line between freedom of speech and hate speech. And then the title of our meeting today, or our workshop, is "Would you ban hate speech?" And actually Peter asked me to respond to this question, so I would say yes. My response is definitely a yes, and I have several arguments for that. One of them is that I think history and reality has to teach us that now states have to go beyond just merely allow people to speak freely, because we could see that it has led in the past to tragical consequences. And I think the naive idea that if we just let people speak, then it will all come and solve itself, I think it's a misconception. What I think we have to now put more emphasis on is the obligation of states of ensuring social cohesion and pluralism and friendship among different groups in the societies. So I'm, in that sense, I'm very critical actually of the US approach, I have to say. And I'm very much in friendship with the Canadian approach, and I do encourage you to read actually Professor Rosenfeld's piece, because it does go through different approaches. And I was also requested to reflect on the articles from the book, so I will try to use some examples from this very excellent book, by the way. What I would like to say here also, I mean, the Canadian approach considers the long-term impact of hate speech. It goes beyond the imminent danger, but it actually keeps in mind what impact hate speech can have on the target group and on the non-target group, which I think is very important. And as it is discussed also in Professor Rosenfeld's essay, on the target group, the impact can be that these groups might feel humiliated, degraded, and inferior, and it also might lead to their isolation in the society. But if you keep in mind the effect on non-target group, the audience, it will be also one possible effect is that they will become desensitized, and because of this desensitization, they will actually accept these racist and discriminatory ideas because it will just be part of the normal discourse. So I think we do need to keep in mind these long-term consequences, and when we assess the actual cases and how imminent the danger or the violence it is, I think we have to step beyond and actually look at the big picture where this allowance of hate speech cases can actually lead into a society. Now, having said that, I would like to mention to you, actually go through a few justifications that serve to argue for freedom of speech, and I might be challenged again by Miklós Haraszti, because I know that he is actually an advocate for free speech and he is very much protecting it. But what I have to say is that regardless what justification you take, if you take the justification from the social contract, from democracy, from the legitimacy of legislation, or from autonomy, as it is discussed in your essay as well, I think if you look at it from the minority perspective, all of these justifications can systematically fail. And the reason for that is that, unfortunately, today we are dealing with a structural and historical inequality in our societies. So the justification from the point of democracy, I mean, if we say that freedom of speech must be secured because all ideas should be listened to and everybody should have a say, yes, it's true, but does everybody have a say in the society? Is everybody heard on an equal basis? Is there an actually equal opportunity to exchange ideas? No. If you look at the reasoning that eventually more speech will lead to truth, because truth, I mean, that was John Stuart Mill, very utopistic, I have to say, and idyllic and naive imagination, that if we just allow more people to speak, eventually it will lead us to truth. Now, I mean, history taught us, I think, that just because there are more people to speak and there is more speech, it doesn't necessarily means that there will be the truth prevailing. I mean, if you look at the case of Rwanda, and then I will come back to this example a bit later when talking about media. I mean, you can see that it's clearly the truth does not prevail if there are oppressed groups who don't have a say in the public discourse. And if you look at this from the point of legitimacy or social contract, that a free speech should be allowed because everybody should be able to influence the legislation and the public discourse. Yes, in an ideal world, that would be very nice. But again, do minority people have the same access, for example, to decision-making bodies or to the media? Can they actually really take part in making a social contract? Are their views sought? Are they listened to? Are they heard? No, in many cases we say that they are not. I also would bring in here the critical race theory, which says that in a society, if there is an historic discrimination and oppression of various groups, then the voice coming from these groups will be also considered inferior. And I think this is something very important to understand. And again, if you think about the case in Rwanda, you have a public media which is controlled by the government, where everything can be said against the Tutsis. Now maybe you have a community radio by the Tutsis, but can they reach out to the same audience? Can they convince them about the other side of the coin and their own truth? No, there is no equal access to media as well. So I would really encourage all of us to think about all this justification from a minority perspective, keeping in mind the structural inequalities of our societies and the vulnerability of certain groups. I was also asked today to actually give, of course, concrete and practical recommendations on how we should deal with hate speech cases. And I can tell you that in the UN we have been struggling. I'm in the UN, yeah, I'm an independent expert of the UN, but we independent experts, special rapporteurs, as well as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights have been struggling with coming up with a common standpoint. So there has been a process which I'd like to introduce you to and present to you, which is called the Rabat process, which ended up in a Rabat plan of action. What you should know about this process is that it involved the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the special rapporteurs, the regional experts, and CERT committee members. And then there were various workshops held all around the world in different regions to try to come up with some kind of agreement on where to draw the line between freedom of speech and hate speech. Now, the events took place throughout 2011 in Vienna, that was the first one, then it went to Nairobi, then it went to Bangkok, and then Santiago de Chile, and finally the plan of action was adopted in Morocco, that's why it has the name Rabat Plan of Action. And then I would like to, I'm sorry if I will be a bit boring, but I have to read because I don't want to misquote the document, and I find it quite important to go through the main findings. The document, which is publicly available, and I hope you will have a chance to read, actually discusses the context of what we are working in, and then it goes to examine the legislation, the judiciary, and the policy-making aspects. And then it goes into, and then it looks into different realities and recommendations. Now, the context, of course, that was been discussed, and I think it's very clear to all of us who are interested in this topic, is that the world is ever more connected, and the fabric of societies has become more multicultural in nature. But there have been a number of incidents which have brought renewed attention to the issue of incitement to hatred, and it should be underlined that many of the world's conflicts in past decades have also contained a component of incitement to national, racial, or religious hatred. And I would like to call your attention that we do discuss religious hatred here as well, not only racial or ethnic, which is, of course, covered by the third convention. We also made the statement that the realization of the right to freedom of expression enables vibrant, multifaceted public interest debate, giving voice to different perspectives and viewpoints. Respect for freedom of expression has a crucial role to play in ensuring democracy and sustainable human development, as well as promoting international peace and security. However, as we have discussed today, individuals and groups have unfortunately suffered, for example, for reason of their ethnicity or religion, from various forms of discrimination, hostility, or violence. One particular challenge in this regard is to contain the negative effects of a manipulation of race, ethnic origin, and religion, and to guard against the adverse use of concepts of national unity or national identity, which are often instrumentalized, including for political and electoral purposes. As I told you, first, the Rabat Action Plan goes into legislation, and it went all around the regions to see whether there is a unified or a common approach. As you can expect, the conclusion was that there is an absence of the legal prohibition of incitement to hatred in many domestic legal frameworks around the world. Moreover, legislation that prohibits incitement to hatred uses variable terminology and is often inconsistent with Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which probably you know is actually the exception of freedom of speech. And then it also found, which actually we just heard from Andrei Richter, that the broader the definition is, the more it opens the door for arbitrary application of these laws. Nevertheless, I would say here again that I would always put these on the scale. And I think the opportunity to misuse these laws is always smaller in importance, in my view, than the actually danger that hate speech can bring into a society. Some countries have offenses which cover incitement to racial and religious hatred, while others cover only racial or ethnic issues. Some countries have also recognized the prohibition in incitement on other grounds, such as the unfortunate social group grounds, as we heard from the previous presentation. I would just jump now to refer to the high threshold of Article 20, which I said is a limitation of speech, which must remain an exception. And as you probably know, there is a three-part test for restrictions. One is legality, second is proportionality, third is necessity. What does it mean? That restrictions have to be clearly and narrowly defined and respond to a pressing social need. They have to be the least intrusive measures. They should not be overly broad in that they do not restrict speech in a wide and untargeted way. They have to be proportionate in the sense that the benefit to the protected interest outweighs the harm to freedom of expression, including in respect to the sanctions they authorize. Now I would jump to the jurisprudence, because this is, I think, what brings us really to the concrete assessment of cases. And I would like to call your attention to a sixth threshold test that was proposed by Article 19, the NGO called Article 19, who worked closely with the UN. And this actually brings us back to the previous speakers on what should be assessed when we want to define whether something fell into the category of incitement of hatred or not. Now, the six-part threshold test that is proposed are composed of the following. First, the context, which was very much elaborated before. The speaker, the intent, the content or form of the speech, the extent of the speech. The content or form is one, sorry. So the extent of the speech and the likelihood, that's the sixth. So I would go through quickly on these. The context, as it was said, analysis of the context should place the speech act within the social and political context prevalent at the time the speech was made and disseminated. The speaker, it should be assessed whether what is the position or the status of the speaker in the society, and specifically the individuals or the organization standing in the context of the audience to whom the speech was directed. The intent or intention. We can say that negligence and recklessness are not sufficient for an Article 20 situation, which requires advocacy or incitement. So there should be a triangular relationship between the object and subject of the speech as well as the audience. The fourth threshold is content or form. Content analysis may include the degree to which the speech was provocative and direct, as well as a focus on the form, style, nature of the arguments deployed. Extent of the speech, which is the fifth threshold. It has to be analyzed what was the reach of the speech, its public nature, the magnitude, and the size of the audience. It has to be assessed whether it was broadcast to the mainstream media or internet, what was the frequency, the amount and the extent of the communications, whether the audience had the means to act on the incitement, whether the statement was circulated in a restrictive environment or widely accessible to the general public. And then the last threshold is likelihood, including imminence. Some degree of risk of resulting harm must be identified. It means that the courts will have to determine that there was a reasonable probability that the speech would succeed in inciting actual action. Now let me stop here. The truth is that I wasn't part of this Rabat action plan, which started during my predecessor. And I would like to, because I think we were also asked to refer to today's cases and especially to the Roma situation in Europe. And I would like to call your attention to the problematics of the judiciary and to refer to cases from the very country that hosts this discussion, Hungary, and the problems around applying the hate speech or the hate crime offense. And probably you heard about it, but I just would like to talk a little bit about the offenses taken against Roma people, sentencing them or persecuting them because of hate crime against the Hungarians. And I think this is a serious issue where I have a feeling that judiciary do not go through this threshold test. What happened recently in a case of Sajó Bábony, if you are familiar with the Hungarian context or if you are just interested in hearing about it, what happened is that there was a settlement, Sajó Bábony, where the Magyar Garda people in black uniform have been present, and they actually had a large meeting. And then there were the Roma people who came to the meeting, and there was a kind of like war of words, as we could say, between the Roma people and these extremist groups who came to the town. Now the police came to intervene, but what did the police do? They actually defended the public school where the meeting took place and tried to keep the Roma aside. Then apparently the organizers invited about 600 other extremists to come to the town to join their forces so that they can outnumber the Roma. And what happened is that the police fortunately intervened in time and blocked these extreme rightists to come in larger number to the town. But what happened is that one single car managed to come into town. So the local Roma, because of anger, attacked the car. Now there was a court case just a few months ago which sentenced this Roma because of hate crime, which was directed against the Hungarians because they actually used bats and sticks to beat the car, which came to support the extreme rightists. Now this comes back to the context. If you take it out and if you see a bunch of Roma people shouting, "You Hungarians should die," could it be a hate speech or hate crime case if it comes to action? Yes, probably it would. But then if you look at the context, that these people were actually provoked for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then it was actually a counterattack for the provocation, then I think you have to come to a different conclusion. You have to come to the conclusion that even if there was a destroy of property, the question whether it was a hate crime and there was a motive of hate crime is very much questionable. And I would also like to question here, or just remind ourselves the confusion in this case about how can Roma call how can a Roma go against a group called Hungarians when themselves are Hungarians, right? So this is how the whole thing gets confused, because Roma themselves are Hungarians. So how can you charge them from hating Hungarians who are themselves as well? So I would like to come back to this issue of how the judiciary should be aware of the context and of the local situation. And again, it comes back also to the actual reach of the action. And then policies, which I don't know, I don't think I have much time, so I won't go through in details. But it's important that it's not only the state, of course, who has responsibilities here of, first of all, refraining from using hate speech, but on the other hand, to speak up against such forms of hate speech and to protect the target groups. But there are other, of course, the NGOs, the academia, and the police, and then the independent human rights institutions have a role. But I would like to stop here, because the Rabat Plan of Action talks about the registration and functioning of minority media. And I'm very, very careful with minority media. And I have to make a point here that I believe that minority media has and should only be established if there is a mainstream media that is inclusive enough and which already has minority participation. In my experience, I have seen many states who just open a shortwave radio frequency that is given to minorities, and then they think that their job is finished. Minority media can be perfectly used for culture or for the preservation of cultural language, but it should not be a substitute to inclusive mainstream media. Because as I said also in the Rwandan examples, but we can bring up many other examples, media is many times manipulated or at least controlled by majority people. And then, of course, it is very difficult to expect them to have an objective portrayal when they don't include people who are portrayed in the various news. So I would like to talk, I would like to stress the importance of inclusive media. And again, the freedom of speech does not mean the power to be heard. So just because you give a small media station to minorities and then you ask them to be happy with it, it doesn't mean that the representation and the objective portrayal will be established in that society. But then we also have to mention here, of course, the very sad fact that even if, like, BBC and Guardian now report like a 50% intake of non-white people to their traineeship board, we have to say that it's still a small percentage of non-white people who actually get into media, even commercial mainstream media or public media, and even less who actually stay there. One of the reasons is that, as the former head of BBC said, that probably they don't feel welcome. And one of the reasons is that sometimes minority people, when they get to the public media, they feel that the criteria of objectivity should lead their not taking a stand on the side of the minority group. So they are afraid that if there is a black person who has to report on an assault against a black community, and he's reportedly many times afraid that if he will support the black group against the non-black attackers, for example, then he will be biased, and then he won't match the objectivity criteria. So they rather don't say anything about these attacks. So I think this is something that is very concerning. And then I would have a lot more to say, but I just one more message. The responsibility of community. We do talk about the judges, we do talk about the governments. Let's not forget the role of the community. And there is a movie that was screened here in this very building at CEU, which is called the Not in Our Town movie, which I recommend you to watch if you haven't done that. It's about a small American town where the community decided to stop hate crime. They all acted upon together to defend their Jewish and Black and Asian migrants. It was because of a dedicated police commander who has seen similar cases and decided to just cut it at the beginning. It's because of the local community who didn't look at the perpetrators but looked at the victims and decided to side with them and take solidarity with them. And then it's, of course, because of the very heavy presence of human rights organizations that would team up and defend the local victims. So I would not want always us to just feel easy and to put the obligation on governments on what they do with this. But I think we all have to take a stand, and we all have to learn how to do community action. And I'm sure that Peter's theater piece later will also reflect some of those. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you so much. I have to add to the outrage of the Sajó Babony case that there is an absolute dissimilarity between adjudication of similar cases when it comes to non-Roma or to whites. The many threatening and actual violence cases against Roma, including the infamous, most famous serial killing of Roma in Hungary back 2 years ago, have never been labeled as hate crime, as hate speech. Practically, with maybe one exception, so far, only Roma have been charged with hate crime. And that fact alone, actually, near to our subject, shows that you need a standard. You need a standard. Out of context, speaker, intention, context, and extend the criteria that the Rabat principles have. It was enough to take out the first one, context. And the subjective decision, the ruling was already there. So I will have the same provocative questions to you, to Michel. And the essence, the gist of which is, please help us to come up a content banning standard. That is the issue. And let me introduce now Anders Moles. Moles? Moles. He is representing our own university, and he is from the Philosophy and Political Science department, and I know many of his students are here in the audience and waiting for his.
Thanks.
Which side are you on?
On the banning side. I guess on this table in the majority. So one problem about content-based regulations is that it's not entirely clear what does that mean. So one might think, so one way of thinking about content-based regulation is that a content-based regulation is one in which the content plays at least some role in the regulation. And context-neutral regulation appeal only to the time, manner, and place. So that's one way to think about content-based regulation. If you say something about the content, that qualifies as a content-neutral, as a content-based regulation. Another way to think about that is to say that content-based regulations, so that content-based regulations appeal only to the content of speech, and content-neutral regulations appeal to also to other facts. So which sides we take, I think, will depend very much on how we think about the harms of speech and how we think about what kinds of speech should be regulated. So I take it that, for instance, what Michel said, he thinks that it's not you cannot have a regulation which speaks only about the content of speech. You also need to pay attention to some of the context. But that's not enough to make it content-neutral regulations, because you could understand the content as being necessary or sufficient. So what I want to say is that I tend to think that the second version is best. So you could have a content-neutral regulations even if you mention somehow the context, insofar as you also mention the context. And the reason perhaps to think that we have more reasons to think in this way have to do with the way in which you identify the harms of speech. So it seems that there are these three different harms that speech could produce. So one, speech could be kind of intrinsically harmful when it just goes against the dignity of persons or something like that. But the harms can go beyond that. So another harm that speech could have is being just offensive. So perhaps some forms of hate speech profoundly offend bypassers and targets. And the third kind of harm that speech could have is just to change the distribution of beliefs. And that later can have impact on opportunities or segregation or discrimination. So I think which of these versions of content-based regulation we favor depends on which kind of harm we privilege. So if we think that what matters about speech, or what is most harmful about speech, is the intrinsic harms it has, then we could say, well, it's enough to have only content-based regulations that speak only about the context. If we care about offense or the distributional harms, I think the context becomes more salient. So perhaps one way to think about this is that this distinction between content-based and context-based is a bit artificial. In many cases, we want to restrict speech because it's in virtue of its content, in certain contexts, it provokes this or that harm. Now, it's also important to keep in mind that it's not enough to show that speech is harmful. I think that the way of thinking about, if we have a specific free speech principle, we need to show that regardless of its harm, there are still important reasons to protect it. So those of us who think that some regulation of speech are adequate, it's not enough just to show that it is harmful. There are additional reasons to protect speech. So some of the reasons I think Richter and Michel mentioned are the reasons of truth, or democracy, or autonomy. And that give us another distinction that we might want to make between something which we could call uncovered speech, which is just speech or form utterances that fall outside of any justification. Right? So, I don't know, monkey chants in stadiums that are neither good for truth, nor for democracy, nor for autonomy. So they're just, technically speaking, they are not speech. They are just kind of noise, so to speak. And I guess fighting words, slurs, all those are not speech. So they are just uncovered. Other forms of speech might be covered by the principle. We might say that perhaps there are some reasons of truth or some reasons of democracy or some reasons of autonomy to protect them. But that's still not sufficient to say that they should be protected, because those forms can be outweighed by other considerations. So the idea is that if those who want to ban hate speech need not only to show that it is harmful, that's not sufficient. We also need to show that either it's uncovered, so it's not covered by any of the reasons to protect it, or perhaps there are outweighing reasons to regulate speech. And the third difficulty, of course, has to do with legal implementation. There may be many forms of speech that we think we should regulate, but we just can't regulate. Perhaps for publicity reasons, because they are open to abuse. So that's a third difficulty. I know very little about that because I'm not a lawyer, but I'm more interested in the justification of that. Now, so there are, I guess, two. So one of the justifications, which is the truth-based, and I think Michel's paper mentioned it that widely, is that it seems that whenever truth is at stake, we have very strong reasons to protect speech, despite of its cost. But notice that argument doesn't hold in general. So we have outside of speech, in many cases, we restrict the propagation of truth, of the seek of truth, for other moral reasons. So imagine, for instance, how much we could advance medicine if we could conduct experiments on human beings. But we don't do that. We say that we sacrifice the truth or the seek of truth for some other moral reasons. And it might be that with speech is the same. So we might want to censor some truths because moral reasons having to do with equal status or with the distributional effects. Another distinction or another point is that the significance of context also appears when we think about the interest that speakers have in uttering certain words. So it's not only that people want to say to express their ideas. They usually wanted to express to a wide audience, and that's where the context comes. So it's not the same, for instance, to have parades in the center of town than sending the Magyar Garda to a very remote place in the hills in which they can say whatever they want. The interest is to be heard. And that's where the context also becomes important. So as an extreme case, you could think of a free speech booth, which is kind of a soundproof booth in which people can just go in and say whatever they want. That wouldn't be the point of speech. So the point of speech is just to reach wide audiences. And once we think about wide audiences, so the context in which people want to express their views, the problem of captive audiences come. So whenever people want to express their views, there will be some captive audiences. And then the burden of the proof comes to say whether the fact of captive audiences might provide sufficient reasons to go against the propagation of certain ideas. And that makes a distinction between, for instance, I don't know, the Skokie case in which people wanted to parade in a city than having, I don't know, a theatrical play in which people mock a religion or something like that, or a private club in which racist jokes are said. So I think these considerations suggest that the picking up only the content of speech won't do much work. What we need to look is at the context and the way in which beliefs are propagated and the way in which speech has certain effects, beyond just, I don't know, uttering demeaning words or something like that. So yeah, I think I'll stop for now. So I don't know, we open the floor, I guess.
Thank you so much, Andres. I would suggest the following method in the remaining 35 minutes, 32 actually. Peter, you put 2 questions and I put 2 questions. What about that? Questions? Go ahead, please.
Thanks, maybe. Yes, so quickly, thanks so much to you all. And my 2 questions are that, so we have been talking, you have been talking about in what combination content and context matters, and you said several times that both matters in some ways, but it seems to me that it is a choice. It is still a choice. It's a choice that to which one of these 2 factors you give priority. You decide on the legal limit of incitement to hatred, most importantly based on the context, in which context it creates danger, or most importantly based on the content. And it seems that context can matter with the priority of the content. For example, if we consider Holocaust denial, then context matters as well, but it might matter for sort of sensitivity reasons, that it causes much deeper emotional harm. Denying the Holocaust in Germany or Hungary, or denying the genocide in Rwanda, it causes much more harm. So what is your priority? If you agree that it is a choice to choose either content or context as the decisive element. And that's my problem with the robot plan of action, the 6-part test and the Article 19 test. We will hear from Sijal about that as well, that it put everything together. It might feel like, yes, this is the solution. It's a combination of all this. We consider everything, but it's not clear which is the decisive element. And I think it's a choice. And the other question is just very quickly, specifically to Andrei, that where would Andrei, you would place the Russian system from the Supreme Court resolution and the other things you described? Would it fall in the content-based approach with all nuances, or it's somewhere in between? And just one more specific to Rita, and then I close, that so you described, and I so much agree with you, Rita, as well on this, that, and as Miklos said as well, how outrageous the Sajó-Babon decision was, and the abuse of hate crime legislation in Hungary against Roma Hungarians. But so considering that abuse, which is really in front of us, would you still trust the law enforcement system in Hungary to try to apply? And I don't mean to be ironic on this, because emotionally I am so much with you. I would ban all that awful, ugly stuff. But would you trust what Andres mentioned, considering the policy issue, would you trust this law enforcement system? Because maybe in the US, in the context where Michel is coming from, maybe we could trust the system, that they would not turn it against the very discriminated minority itself.
But maybe just joining the question, the question could be understood in 3 ways. The first one is very political, the present day, about the present day law enforcement system in present day Hungary. The second version of the question is, can it be reformed into a working one? And the third one, any law enforcement system in Hungary. You can choose. Based on its cultural, mental, historical peculiarities.
Who replies?
I think maybe you start. I'm sorry.
Well, I have a quick answer to the long questions. In my humble opinion, I think that content is more important for the European system of law, while context is more for the common law system. While in both systems, of course, in my view, one contextual element which is of crucial importance and is missing quite often is the independence of the court system.